Imagine a pregnant, enslaved woman weeping in the dead of night after emerging from her master's quarters. No one dares comfort her. Her master's wife knows the abuse she suffers, yet it continues relentlessly. Driven to despair, this woman makes an unimaginable choice to protect her unborn child from the horrors of slavery. This is just one glimpse into the brutal reality faced by enslaved people. What other atrocities were committed, hidden from history books and whispered in hushed tones? Join us as we uncover the most chilling and disturbing practices of slavery. Truths you won't believe. The Black History Archives reveal a multitude of horrors. One such atrocity was the practice of cutting off the ears of deceased slaves for insurance purposes. During the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, the insatiable greed for profit reduced human beings to mere commodities. For ship captains, even death presented a financial opportunity. They viewed enslaved Africans not as people, but as cargo to be bought, sold, or discarded at will. If a slave perished during the voyage due to illness or harsh conditions, insurance companies frequently refused to pay. To circumvent this, captains devised a gruesome tactic, severing the ears of the deceased as proof they had been thrown overboard. This horrific act aimed to appease insurers by suggesting the slaves were jettisoned not due to natural causes, but to lighten an overloaded vessel. The Zong Massacre of 1781 stands as a chilling example. Captain Luke Collingwood, commanding the British slave ship Zong, orchestrated the mass drowning of over 130 enslaved Africans in the Atlantic. While he claimed the ship was low on water, historians have since exposed a more sinister motive: financial gain through insurance fraud. Many slave ships were deliberately overloaded from the outset. Captains and traders understood the risks, but this overcrowding was a calculated strategy. By cramming as many enslaved Africans as possible onto their ships, they guaranteed a surplus. Mid-voyage, they would then discard some overboard, claiming it was a necessary measure to prevent the ship from sinking, thus justifying insurance claims. The most disturbing aspect is that many of the enslaved individuals were selected with the grim understanding that they were destined for disposal. They were never meant to reach their destination. This callous calculation epitomizes the complete dehumanization of Africans in the eyes of their captors, who saw them as disposable assets to be exploited for profit. Another horrific practice was infanticide as an act of mercy. In the brutal world of slavery, some enslaved Black mothers made the unimaginable choice to end their children's lives, sparing them from a future of suffering and bondage. For these mothers, this tragic act was the only mercy they could offer, a desperate attempt to shield their offspring from the horrors they themselves endured. They believed death was a kinder fate than the brutality of slavery. This act also served as a form of resistance, denying white households the future slaves that fueled their economies. The story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman in the United States in 1856, poignantly illustrates this despair. Facing capture by slave catchers, Margaret killed her 2-year-old daughter rather than see her return to a life of enslavement. Oral histories from the 1930s further reveal heartbreaking accounts of enslaved mothers who, in their desperation, viewed infanticide as their last act of control over their children's destiny. Anthropological studies and archaeological findings also suggest that some enslaved women may have secretly taken their infants' lives, as evidenced by unusual infant burials at slave burial grounds. Black children, some as young as 5 years old, were among the most vulnerable victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Treated as mere commodities, they were chained, shipped, and sold without a shred of regard for their innocence. Shipping records and manifests listed them alongside other goods, reducing their lives to mere numbers valued solely for their potential profit. Upon arrival on plantations, many endured child breaking, relentless physical and psychological abuse designed to crush their spirits and mold them into obedient laborers. Separation from their parents further compounded their trauma. Abolitionists documented these horrors, with Frederick Douglass, himself a former child slave, describing the profound trauma inflicted upon young enslaved people. Breaking a child's spirit was crucial for maintaining control, as slaveholders feared any sign of resilience could disrupt their system of exploitation. As appalling as it may seem, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, Europeans exhibited African men, women, and children in human zoos. These grotesque displays, particularly popular in France, Germany, and Belgium, aimed to dehumanize Africans, portraying them as savages and reinforcing colonial ideologies. The 1889 Paris World Fair, featuring a mock African village with 400 inhabitants, stands as a particularly egregious example. The story of Ota Benga, a Congolese man displayed in the Bronx Zoo's Monkey House in 1906, further underscores the dehumanizing nature of these exhibitions. On Caribbean plantations, particularly in Jamaica and Barbados, slave owners employed a cruel tactic known as buck breaking to crush the spirits of strong-willed enslaved men. This involved publicly abusing a male slave in front of his family and peers to humiliate him, strip away his sense of manhood, and assert dominance. The Diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, a British overseer in Jamaica, provide chilling documentation of the sexual abuse inflicted upon both male and female slaves. Historian Trevor Bernard's research reveals how enslaved men who attempted to escape or resisted labor were subjected to this brutal form of public humiliation. Plantation owners also utilized iron cages as punishment. While not the spiked iron maidens of medieval times, these cages tightly confined the body, causing prolonged pain and psychological suffering. Former slaves interviewed during the WPA Slave Narratives Project recounted their experiences or witnessed others enduring this torture. Charles Ball, enslaved in South Carolina, wrote about witnessing fellow slaves confined in these devices for days, unable to sit, stand, or lie down. Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave similarly describes the psychological torment of confinement and isolation. Finally, the practice of rubbing salt into open wounds after whippings added another layer of cruelty. This wasn't done to prevent infection, but to inflict further agony and instill fear. Olaudah Equiano's autobiography describes how overseers on Caribbean plantations would use salt and pepper on wounds, amplifying the pain. Accounts from Jamaican plantations confirm that this practice was particularly common for those caught attempting to escape. Reflecting on these atrocities, it's hard not to feel heartbroken for the countless Black fathers, mothers, and children who endured such unimaginable suffering. These acts of cruelty defy justification. Learning about this dark chapter in history is crucial for understanding the lasting impact of slavery and the importance of fighting for justice and equality. It's essential to continue exploring and sharing these stories of the atrocities inflicted upon enslaved people. The more we understand the extent of their suffering, the better equipped we are to combat racism and injustice in the present. As a woman, I feel a deep responsibility to amplify the voices of those who were silenced and ensure that their experiences are never forgotten. The fight for equality and justice is ongoing, and it's crucial to learn from the past to build a better future. There's much more to uncover, and I encourage everyone to continue learning and engaging with this vital history. What other lesser-known atrocities can you share to shed further light on this dark period? Beyond the well-documented horrors of slavery, numerous other atrocities, often whispered in hushed tones or lost to the passage of time, deserve our attention. These acts of cruelty, both physical and psychological, further illustrate the depths of dehumanization inflicted upon enslaved people. One such practice was the deliberate separation of families. While the heartbreak of mothers losing their children is often highlighted, the tearing apart of entire families, husbands from wives, siblings from one another, inflicted profound emotional trauma. This tactic aimed to break familial bonds and solidify the slaveholders' control, leaving individuals isolated and vulnerable. Imagine the anguish of never knowing the fate of your loved ones, of being ripped away from the only source of comfort and support in a world of unimaginable cruelty. Furthermore, enslaved people were often denied basic medical care. Seen as mere property, their health and well-being were of little concern to their owners. Illnesses and injuries were often left untreated, leading to unnecessary suffering and premature deaths. The denial of medical care wasn't just neglect. It was a calculated form of control, a way to further dehumanize and subjugate enslaved individuals. The psychological torment of slavery extended beyond physical abuse. Enslaved people were constantly subjected to verbal abuse, degradation, and humiliation. They were denied their identities, forced to adopt the names and religions of their oppressors. This systematic stripping away of one's sense of self inflicted deep psychological wounds that persisted across generations. The stories of resistance, resilience, and the unwavering spirit of enslaved people are equally crucial to remember. Despite the horrors they faced, they found ways to maintain their dignity, preserve their cultural heritage, and fight for their freedom. These narratives of hope and defiance offer powerful lessons about the strength of the human spirit and the importance of never giving up the fight for justice. As we delve deeper into this painful history, we must commit to honoring the memory of those who suffered by continuing to work towards a world where such atrocities are never repeated. What other stories of resilience and resistance can we share to inspire hope and action?